Welcome to the Wheats on Your Mind podcast. My name is Aaron Harries. Wheats on Your Mind is brought to you by the Kansas Wheat Commission and Kansas Association of Wheat Growers. On this episode of the podcast, our guest is Brian Bledsoe. Brian Bledsoe is the founder and chief meteorologist and climatologist for Brian Bledsoe Weather. His private weather consulting business has been serving farmers, ranchers, and many other businesses for the past 25 years. Recently retired from television, many of you may also know Brian from having been a broadcast meteorologist for the past 28 years. Brian's goal is to help farmers and ranchers make their businesses more successful by equipping them with actionable forecast information, both short-term and long-term. He's got a background in agriculture, and we're happy to have him on the podcast to kind of take a look back at 2025 and a sneak peek at 2026. Brian, welcome.
Hey, thank you, Aaron, for having me. It's a pleasure.
Well, we're in the high plains of Kansas representing wheat farmers, and you're all too familiar with the high plains of the U.S., being there in eastern Colorado and doing this for many years. And no 2 years are the same, and sometimes the weather stops at the Colorado border and changes at the Kansas border, it seems like. But before we tap into your wisdom a little bit for cropping patterns going into the new year, what sticks out to you as key in 2025? Pretty good wheat crop here in Kansas. You know, right now, if you look at the drought monitor map, we're good. It's kind of unusual.
Well, and I think, that's one of those things where I always talk about seasonal forecasts with folks that I do work for. Is like, this is not something that you look at one part of the year and then let it sit and don't look at it again, 6 months later, because obviously in the high plains, weather changes quite frequently. And a lot of times those changes can be pretty dramatic. So a year ago at this time, and even a little bit beyond, less than a year ago, about a good 10 months or so ago, a lot of signals were coming together that looked like it was going to produce, drier than average conditions, for a large part of the spring and summer. And if you remember where we ended, the winter, and we kind of came out into springtime, there were parts of southwest Kansas that after that big November storm in 2024 didn't see any moisture for about another 5 months after that. So the pattern that was facilitating that was very much locked in. And we had, terrible wind, and we had dirt blowing around in March and whatnot. And then when we got into April, things switched. And I think the thing to keep in mind there is that how things looked like that they were going to behave really kind of pivoted. And the one thing that I can kind of attribute that to is that the sea surface temperatures in the Pacific Ocean ended up being a little bit different than what we thought that they were going to be. And by different, I mean they actually ended up being warmer from the Gulf of Alaska down the west coast of North America. And typically speaking, when that happens, we usually don't have to worry too much about moisture, usually. As you said, every year is different, so we have to watch that. But we were looking at those sea surface temperature anomalies, having a good shot at being cooler than average. And when that happens, we usually suffer from drought. So it's one of those things where, someone says, oh, you guys are wrong all the time, whatever. It really isn't just about that. It's about knowing how and when to pivot from that forecast when you can see that it's not going to end up maybe the way you originally thought. And I will say this, if we're going to be wrong, so to speak, I would much rather be wrong on that side of the coin versus calling for a bunch of water and ended up being dry, if you know what I mean.
Absolutely. So there are things I know folks like you look at. There's different oscillations, there's water temperatures, the MJO, the ENSO, and not only do you look at those, you have to balance out which one you're going to give more strength to, right? And so what are you looking at right now?
Well, and to your point there, I think it's really important about the messaging when we talk about La Niña and El Niño, because it gets screwed up all the time. It really does, because there's a lot of, I would say media outlets that put out, it is happening just because of this or just because of that. And in many cases, El Niño and La Niña both get way too much credit and way too much blame for the things that they do create or don't create. But right now, we are locked into a La Niña episode where we are seeing cooler than average sea surface temperature anomalies right there along the equator west of South America. And this La Niña episode was, a lot of times they will come in twos. A couple of years ago, we actually had 3 in a row. But this is really, the 5th out of the 6 years that we've been dealing with La Nina conditions in the fall and winter season. And last year at this time, we had an episode that was weaker than the one that we have going on right now. And this one that is, kind of locked into us, at least for the time being, is also helping facilitate the type of weather that we're seeing right now. December, you don't have to go too far out of Kansas to get a whole lot drier, and it's been warm. We haven't had as much cold air as we should have. And I know we've had little bouts here and there, but this La Nina event is essentially has been peaking from late November through right now, and it's got a little bit of life left. And then I think by the time we head toward late January and certainly by early February, this thing is going to show itself the door, and we are going to pivot pretty quickly this spring. And by pivot, I mean there's a brief period of neutral that's going to be in there, or La Nada, if you want to call it that. And then we will likely move toward an El Nino event during 26.
And remind me, La Nina and El Nino, which certain months of the year do they have the biggest impact on precipitation and or temperature in this part of the world?
Sure. Historically, we usually see either a La Nina or an El Nino come on during the late summers and falls, and then they kind of go through the winter, and then they kind of wane a little bit as we head toward the spring. That's a typical cycle right there. Typically speaking, La Ninas last a little longer than El Nino events. But with this type of pivot, it's important to note that we're seeing this type of pivot take place during the late winter and spring. And whenever you get a significant change in those sea surface temperature anomalies out there in the Pacific to coincide with that seasonal change, it usually produces some pretty wild weather in the middle part of the country during those spring and early summer months. And again, it's not always the case, but if you go back through history and look at some of this stuff, some of those weather anomalies are pretty significant. And if you want to go to something that has really occurred recently, the last time we did this kind of move from La Nina to an El Nino during this timeline and this time of year, it happened in 2023. And if you looked at Kansas in 2023, boy, it was a tale of two different sides of the state. All right. Mm-hmm. Farther east you get, you got shut out in terms of water and you got hot. The farther west you did, Aaron, I think we had hail start in April and we saw hail go into September, that year. Yep. And a lot of water that was going on too. You have to watch out for those extremes that take place in that type of a pattern too, because they always happen.
Let's take a little sidebar here and talk about analogs. You're looking back at similar weather patterns from previous years. So define that for us and how you make use of that in your forecasting.
Of course. So when you look back through history, because history is such an amazing weather teacher, you have to be cognizant of what's going on with those sea surface temperatures back during that historical time and see if they're matching up closely or even remotely closely to what we're looking at right now. So if you look back at the ENSO cycle and how these pivots took place during this time, and by pivot I mean move from a La Nina to a brief period of neutral toward an El Nino, the last 6 years that happened, and we can go all the way back into the 50s, was 1951, 1965, 1972, 02, 09, and 23. And there are different things you can cherry pick out of those years that were impactful. For example, if we look at March, the way temperatures averaged out for March during those 6 years, we got a signal that is very similar to the type of weather pattern that we've been seeing here recently. And by that, I'm saying a lot of cold air came in late season across Montana, across Wyoming, the northern plains, down into Nebraska. The farther south you got, it wasn't as cold. But if you look at what we've been seeing here recently, that's pretty similar to what those years averaged out to be. And I think that's important to note that there was some lingering La Nina-like pattern that continued to take place in that late winter and spring when you average out all those years before we completely moved toward El Nino. So, and from a precipitation standpoint, if you want to average that out for those years during the month of March, we were drier than average across all of Kansas during March. And that signal is pretty prominent that shows up there. But as I've been telling a lot of folks, it's not going to be how you start out 26 isn't going to be how you finish 26. And when you average those years together, and by the time you go into, say, May and June, that initial dryness that was across Kansas during the month of March ended up with a whole lot of water by the time we went through May and June. So I think that's important to note that we can do those kinds of extremes fairly easily across the Western High Plains, and I doubt this year will be a whole lot different from what we see with those types of years.
Let's set the stage then for the next few months, January, February, March, and April. In 20 years in the wheat industry, I've kind of learned that if we've got a good established crop, which we do in Kansas, looks beautiful right now, and it doesn't get too hot in the wintertime, and we get into April, we can wait pretty long into April before the rains kick in and still have a good crop. So it's nice to get it earlier than that, but how do you see things looking?
Well, I think one of the most important things that we have going for us right now is the majority of us have a full profile. We have not only a really well established wheat crop right now, but we have that profile to work with. And that profile is super important to us because it offers us a bridge in case we do see some early season dryness. And we've had that profile for the past 2 years. And if you go beyond that in the past, we always haven't had that profile to work with. We've had to go through a lot of falls where we've had to dust things in and then just hope for the best after that. So I always get really excited whenever that profile is plentiful, not just in a couple of spots, but really across the whole region. But if we look at what the main driver is likely going to be in the pattern going forward, it's probably going to be this La Niña episode, at least for the rest of this month, and obviously into January and probably into February. And if you look at computer modeling, the way that plays out is that certainly the western part of Kansas has better chances of showing up drier than the eastern part, not only during the month of February or January, but also during the month of February, and then even into March, as I had said, because I still think there's going to be at least a little bit of this La Niña signal hang around, during those first, 2 to 3 months before we can full on pivot. And I did see that pivot really start to take place across the whole state as late as April. Could it happen sooner during the month of March? Sure, we could do that. But I really see that pattern taking shape sort of wetter across the entire state during the month of April right now. And if we shove good water in the ground during the month of April, chances are May is going to be okay. Chances are June is going to be okay. And then we kind of have to see how we sit once we get beyond June, a little bit later. And this is really the important thing here, that with a seasonal forecast like this, drought begets drought. The longer you stay dry, the harder the harder time you're going to have breaking that pattern. But if you see a little bit of dryness early and then you start shoving water in the ground, that wet begets wet, and that helps to stave off summer heat, summer dryness. And so I'm pretty optimistic on how this upcoming crop is going to finish for the reasons that I have just mentioned. Will there be some areas that struggle here and there? I'm sure there will be. There always are. But, if you get into, if you skate through these next couple of months and you don't see a whole lot of water, well, you know what? We usually don't see a whole lot of water in January and February. And even if we have a dry March, we have that profile there to aid us into getting to when that next significant bout of moisture sets up. So for those reasons, that's why I'm optimistic.
Well, we better hop on the hype bandwagon a little bit and talk about polar vortex. Gosh knows you can't have a podcast without talking about that. I always, in that context, want to know if you see any extreme cold episodes. We always worry about winter kill, and we've had in the past couple of years some instances of that. Moisture offsets that in the ground a little bit. But what about the potential for a huge Arctic outbreak, deep freeze?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. With this, La Niña episodes oftentimes help facilitate better chances of those big Arctic outbreaks happening. And the reason that is because when you put an area of high pressure up over the Bering Sea and in the western part of Alaska, what that allows to happen is the flow to come across the pole. And by across the pole, I mean we're able to tap that bitterly cold air from Siberia right down through central Canada and into the middle part of the United States. So that pattern, if you will, is a table setter for what happens beyond that. And we have seen some really big Arctic outbreaks take place with this type of a pattern. One of the more significant ones took place back in February of 2021 when it kicked the entire state of Texas back into the third world for about 3 weeks there because it got so cold right there. So that type of a pattern is always lurking with this. Now, there are a lot of other elements that have to take shape for it to shove itself down into Kansas or even into the southern plains. And so far this year, the lion's share of the coldest air has obviously stayed just to our northeast. Iowa, started out very, very cold on Sunday morning where, those areas were about 10 to 20 below zero. We had temperatures in western Minnesota and the eastern Dakotas that were 20 to 25 below zero, which, for this time of year, we should see some cold. That's fine. But so far, the bulk of the coldest air has been staying off to our northeast. And there are some indications to suggest that that can continue as we go forward over the next couple of months. Will we have cold fronts come through? Yes. Will we have some colder air that is, cold for the time of year move in? I'm sure that we will. But when you look at the overarching pattern here, we also have a lot of flow that's coming in from the Pacific. And that's going to finish off December and January in a very warm fashion across the region. And if we can kind of keep that cold air at bay a little bit longer, well, we get past the solstice, the days start getting longer, we're helped to offset that a little bit. But the long answer to your short question is yes, I think we have to continue to worry about that. And the longer we see warmer than average temperatures persist, that's when our crop starts going to work on that subsoil moisture. And that's when it gets maybe a little bit taller than we want it to, a little bit early. And if we have this, you see where I'm going with this. So
yes,
that's kind of what we have to worry about this year. And to be honest, we usually have to worry about that with most La Niña episodes.
Yep, and those little Arctic dip occasionally into the state, you kind of welcome those after you've had a few days of 50s and 60s in a row to kind of reset everything.
Yeah, because it shouldn't be 70 on Christmas Day, Aaron.
No.
It just shouldn't be.
I agree with you. Brian, one thing I hear a lot, and I was talking with producer Dave here before we went on the air, is change in seasonality, shifting seasons. It seems, at least from perspectives, that maybe the falls are starting later and springs are starting later. Do you feel that? Do you sense that? And if that is that a climate thing? Is that attributable to some of these longer term decade oscillations? What's your perspective?
Whenever somebody asks me about climate change or if it's real or if it's manufactured or whatever, the real short answer to that question is our climate has been changing since the dawn of time, since this planet's been here. And that is never going to stop. Okay. So where are we in these particular oscillations or in this period of change, I think is a really important question. And I think that that's the question that really needs to get more headlines versus anything else, because do we really know where we are in these oscillations? I'm not entirely sure that we do. Can we recognize what these different oscillations mean for us by using historical accounts? Sure, absolutely. But when you're trying to put those into context in terms of time, and especially geologic time, it's like analyzing a grain of sand in a barn. Okay, it's like a little bit of a snapshot. And one of the more important oscillations that I have focused on really over the past quarter century is the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. And the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, for those that may have not heard it before, is about a 20 to 30 year oscillation where it flips back and forth, where the Pacific goes through a warmer phase. And during that warmer phase, that helps to facilitate more frequent and longer lasting El Niño episodes. And we saw that from about 76 until about 96, 1976 through about 1996. And if you go back through time, and I grew up and I refer to the 90s as the golden age of agriculture in the Western High Plains. We didn't have to worry about drought, during that time. You could get a 2-inch rain when you needed it at a drop of a hat. And that in many cases is due to the fact that the Pacific was in that warmer state. Now, in 1998, the Pacific flipped and went to a colder state. And we are still there right now. This is year 27 of being in that cold or negative phase of the PDO. And if you look back at what has happened over the past, 27 years, I think you could really talk to almost any farmer or rancher in the Western High Plains and ask them if they had more good years or bad years during the past. And I think almost all of them would say we've had a lot more challenging years than what we came out of. I mean, what a cruel joke, right? You come out of the 90s and you go into what we've had to deal with off and on, in the 2000s, where we've had, certainly more years where we've had drought than not. That doesn't mean that there can't be good years in that pattern. We obviously just had one in this, but I think it's important to note that these oscillations are really significant drivers in what we see long term. And that's one of the main reasons why I really latched onto this within my business and started really talking and reaching out to farmers and ranchers, telling them what they need to be prepared for and what they really need to watch out for going forward. Because in the agricultural community, there just simply wasn't enough of that going on. There wasn't enough research being done and use of that research to really dial in your risk management skills on your particular farm or ranch and use that to your advantage going forward. So I think you almost can't pay attention to it enough in my mind.
Bill Gates made some really big news a few weeks ago where he said CO2 is not going to destroy the world. We need to adapt to it. And, are we getting greener in the central and southern plains, the high plains? Is our dryline moving west because of the cropping systems changes? It used to be just continuous wheat. You had bare ground for so many parts of the year. Now you've got corn transpiring. What are some of those things that you might see changing due to cropping systems, or can you attribute any of that?
Well, before I get into the scientific part of that, as someone who spent 28 years in the media, it's really frustrating to me how much that message got politicized for several years. So if you hear somebody like Bill Gates come out and say something like that, I think most of us knew that CO2 probably wasn't going to kill us all, but that message was politicized from the get-go. And in an age where we've never had more information at our fingertips. And the sad thing about that is we've never had more disinformation at our fingertips. And for me, and I just got through talking about this at the California Cattlemen's Convention not that long ago. And even I was in Billings, Montana at the Montana Stock Growers. And I was really trying to drive the point home that you really have to know the quality of your source when you're getting this type of information. Because in my mind, it's never been more important in our lifetimes. So when you're focusing on these messages, you always have to kind of take it with at least a little bit of a grain of salt, because there's so much narrative out there right now. So to your point, are we changing how green we are across the midsection of the country? And is the dry line moving farther east? And you can see things like that happening. Well, if we have more years of drought in the Western High Plains over the past 25 years or so than we've had good moisture years, well, what does that do to the soil? Well, it dries the soil out. So when you're talking about a dry line that's forming in eastern Colorado down into the panhandles on an afternoon, if that soil is drier than average, well, you're going to mix your atmosphere up more, bring the wind down to the surface, and that wind is going to shove your dry line farther east. So absolutely, you can move it farther east. Climatologically, is it moving farther east? I think it really depends on who you talk to be honest. I've seen some evidence that says, sure, it obviously has. But if you look at evidence of what's gone on over the past, few years, well, we've had some pretty active thunderstorm seasons over the past couple of years in the western part of the country. And I think that owes to what I said originally. The more water you shove in the soil in the Western High Plains, the more you're going to recycle that water out of the ground and build thunderstorms during your thunderstorm season, which shove more water. You see where I'm going with that. But on the opposite side of the coin, the drier you are, you don't have that moisture in the soil to recycle and build those thunderstorms on a daily basis. So those thunderstorms end up being farther east, where there's usually better water in the soil and in the air. And if you have vegetation, if you have a big corn crop or whatever, that vegetation only injects more water vapor into the air to continue that cycle. So it really depends on the type of year that we're seeing. It depends on the type of global patterns that we're seeing, I think, before you can 100% sign off on something like that.
Great information there. Before we wrap up, I do want to ask you your perspective on what AI means for meteorology. I mean, the computer models we have are kind of learning models, right? They've been doing that for decades now. How can AI, there are some new AI models, what's that going to do to forecasting? What's that going to do to weather prediction?
It's already been helping it. And I think it's kind of dangerous because, it's what it's trying to do is make everybody's life easier, right? And it's trying to make jobs easier. And that includes myself, as a meteorologist. And the difference between, and I'll just kind of go off a little bit on computer modeling and what we're seeing as far as computer model advancements here in the United States versus abroad. There are many times, and if folks listen to me talk, or whether it's on my podcast or online, Twitter, whatever, or at a particular venue, I always tell them that the European Center for Medium Range Weather Forecasting has consistently been the gold standard in computer modeling for years. And the big reason that is because they put a lot more research and development into their products abroad than what we do here in the United States. And for whatever reason, all we've tried to do here in the United States is cut funding for research and development when it comes to weather technology. And I've always thought that was a huge mistake. Maybe I'm biased because it's my job. But when I see advancements like that taking place, where you pair the artificial intelligence with a computer model that is already doing a good job, that is only going to make those forecasts more accurate. Does it mean that you can just look at it and take it at face value? No, absolutely not. And I think that's the real danger that we have to walk that line, because a human set of eyes, the experience in recognizing patterns and knowing what they do, I think will always be invaluable to that. So when you take the good experience and you pair it with adequate computer modeling, and then you factor in the machine learning ability with AI into that, I can't see a situation where it won't make our product, our forecasting, and more importantly, what we do with that information even better. Because for me, I'm going to be a dinosaur here. I'm 51 years old. I'm going to be a dinosaur here in about 10 years in terms of meteorology and all this kind of stuff. But I'll tell you what, the thing that I think is really important is the messaging with that type of information, and being able to take that information and make it be meaningful to farmers and ranchers that don't have time to sit down and sort through that kind of thing. So for me, it's really the communication aspect that's going to be huge versus just simply the science. The science is going to be great. The advancements are going to be fantastic, but it's how you communicate that message that I think is going to be even more important.
Tell us about the type of services you can offer to farmers to kind of help them do their job better.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you're interested in what I can do for you, you can just simply go to brianbledsoeweather.com. There are no weather maps on my website. That's not what I do. This is simply a medium to get in contact with me so I can give you a quote for your business. But I do daily stuff. I sent stuff out this morning about what the forecast looks like, even if it's not going to change a whole lot. But more importantly, from an agricultural standpoint, I send a lot of stuff out to my clients every single month, centered around seasonal forecast planning on doing things that they can do better. And I've got clients scattered from Montana all the way across, Great Plains, as far south as Texas, as far east as Iowa. Right there in the middle part of the country is kind of my wheelhouse, just simply because I love the people, and that's the weather that I'm most familiar with. So if you're interested in what I can do for you, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. You could also hit me up on X or Twitter. Just simply search for @Brian Bledsoe, and we can have a good discussion about that.
Yeah, your kind of service is important. Guys are kind of hesitant on putting fertilizer in wheat right now and kind of waiting to see what spring's going to look like. And so that's important to us in our business. So just out of curiosity, the private weather sector, gentlemen like yourselves, how has that grown in the past few years?
Well, it's really grown because I'll give you an example of why it's so important as far as the private sector. If you look at what happened to the National Weather Service over the past year, really, in the amount of cuts that had taken place just simply from the National Weather Service. Well, that National Weather Service is responsible for delivering forecasts all across the United States. If you take funding off of something like that, if you limit the amount of staffing that they have, well, that puts those folks immediately behind the eight ball. So from a private forecasting standpoint, I can talk directly to the producer on a daily basis with no government entity to circumvent that whatsoever. I think that the private weather industry is only going to get bigger. I think it's only going to become more technologically advanced. And I think that part of the private sector is probably key importance going forward that's really going to branch out is when it comes to warning for severe thunderstorms. You know, the Doppler radar network across the country is decrepit right now. It needs some serious updating. There need to be more radars out there in these holes. There are many of them across the Great Plains to help, with warning for storms. And I think we're only going to see more of that investment in the private sector to go along with that. And that is something that I completely advocate for, 100%.
Brian, thanks for joining us. This has been a great discussion, some great insight, and I'm sure we will have you back again. Appreciate your time.
Fantastic, Aaron. I appreciate you having me on today.
Thank you to Brian Bledsoe for being my guest on this episode. If you have a topic you'd like us to cover in the future or have a question for one of our guests, please email us at kswheat@kswheat.com. All previous episodes of the Wheats on Your Mind podcast are at wheatsonyourmind.com or Apple and Spotify. Thanks for listening.